Welcome back to Pride in Diversity, supporting LGBT colleagues at work. Hopefully you've all had a good lunch break and ready for a very interesting and detailed panel session that we have now for the next just about nearly an hour or so. So first of all, it's without further ado to welcome our four esteemed panelists. It's great to have such a variety of people. So I will introduce all in one go, and then each of them will have roughly 10 minutes to talk about their view around LGBT positive and inclusive cultures. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers for a further half an hour, hopefully getting into some of the detailed aspects of the things that our panelists talk about. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Reeta Loi, founder and CEO of Gaysians, Tom Ketteley, Assistant Director, Appeals, Litigation and Admin Review Directorate, UK Visas and Immigration at the Home Office, Jacqui Gavin, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at British Volt, and Ian Adams, NHS Director and internationally recognised LGBT+ model. Great to have you all here this afternoon, and I'm going to start with Reeta's to go for the first 10 minutes. So over to you, Reeta.
Hi there, thanks Adrian. It's Reeta Loi, and I'm a writer and music artist, and I'm also a community builder. I've spent about 20 years working in brands, agencies, and tech startups, basically. So I have a business background, but I moved into sort of activism space more actively probably about 7 or 8 years ago. And the reason for that is that I'm Indian, I'm British Indian, and for most British Asians, actually, it's extremely difficult to be out. And so the majority of our community is actually living in a situation where they are having to censor or silence their sexuality or their gender identities in their personal lives and in their homes, and then obviously by extension into their workspaces. And I certainly found that in the various environments that I've been in, whether that's been sort of business or publishing or the music industry or most spaces that I've been in, there's always been an element of having to sort of censor my identity. And as I sort of started to become more of a spokesperson for our community in the media, just because I wasn't seeing people like myself who were out and looked like me and you know were Asian, let alone Asian women, in either in queer spaces, and I felt very compartmentalized. So for me, it was a case of I can be Asian and not gay in Asian spaces, or I can be gay and assimilate to non-Asianness, however else you want to define that, in the other spaces that I was finding. So there was real dissection of identity, and I think that's really, really unhealthy for people, and that's still happening. So being a spokesperson in the media, albeit under pseudonyms and anon for about 6 or 7 years, I started to eventually use my name and face publicly about 4 years ago for the reasons that I stated. I'd been out for 20 years and I still wasn't seeing people like me. So I started an organisation called Gaysians, and the website is gaysians.org. We are, and the business model is literally something that you don't see in the activism space, and the business model is a business model because my background is business. And I was working with organisations like the Red Bull Media House team, working on partnerships. And so it seemed really natural to me, as somebody that works in digital marketing, to set up a website that had listed on it all of the sort of support groups and charities and organisations and grassroots movements that were happening around the UK that were supporting LGBT+ South Asian people. Because I spent many years trying to find people like me, and I couldn't find anyone, as I said, and that included online. So by the time Google came along and I was Googling it, let's just say when you type in Indian lesbian into Google, you're not going to find a support group. So other types of content, shall we say. So I set up Gaysians.org with a view to, I actually went to an event at the House of Lords 4 or 5 years ago, and it was focusing on South Asian LGBT plus people, and there were a couple of charities there that I met, and I met a handful of other people that were in my community, and that was a huge thing. It was a huge thing for me, and also met some MPs who were amazing, and we worked collectively to change legislation in India in 2018. Along with lots and lots of other people around the world, to remove criminal legislation, Section 377, which is huge. So that event was actually massive for our community, because that's really where the roots of Gaysians came together as a kind of activist movement using my business skills. We now have 24 organisations that we work with. We are about to announce a US partnership, and we work behind the scenes with lots of organisations in India and more broadly South Asia. In the UK, the 24 organisations that we work with span organisations that support mental health and have helpline numbers. We work with charities to help them understand the nuances of the South Asian community when it comes to mental health. So, for example, if it's a LGBT specific helpline number, more than likely they won't have anybody Asian there to answer the phone. So we are there coaching their teams and then putting call outs to our community to take those jobs. We work with Asian organisations that provide helpline numbers, but they won't necessarily have anybody that's LGBT working for them. So we are then training them. We also work with sexual health partners. Obviously, sexual health in the LGBT plus community has generally been focused around men's sexual health, and we are increasingly focused on all bodies, trans bodies, trying to get ahead of it with conversations like consent. Strategically, we focus on a few different themes through the year, and that includes home and homelessness prevention, and AKT, Albert Kennedy Trust, formerly our key homelessness prevention partner. And so, yeah, we have 24 organisations that span different faiths. We work with every type of faith group. We work with everything across the LGBT plus community. We work with organisations that support different parts of South Asian identities, different castes, etc. So the reason that Gaysians has been necessary is because most of these organisations haven't been talking to each other previously, and because they're not talking together, because they're not working together, it just means that they aren't getting visibility, they're not getting funding. It means that they're not able to join up and collectively work together. So we sit as a kind of umbrella brand, and our job is to essentially platform and promote those organisations so that people can find them more easily, not just online, but also not just on search, but also social media and through our website. We publish articles, we put on events, we have a radio show. I write for multiple publications. I'm contributing editor at Gay Times as well, and a reporter at Vice. So we're just constantly trying to, at the moment, we're really in the infancy of our movement. And what that for me means is really joining the dots of the different organisations around the world that are offering services to our community in order for our community to access that support, and as they do, increasingly receive more funding. So the organisations we work with are charities in the most part, and they have been getting more visibility, more access to users, and therefore more funding. We are completely unfunded. We don't receive a penny of funding. This has been completely self-funded by me for the last 4 or 5 years now. We desperately need funding. We don't know how to do that. So that's kind of us. It's been very much a sort of organic process. I have a team of 7 people that span different skill sets and identities as well in terms of faith and gender and sexuality, based around the UK, and they have different specialisms that they bring to the table. But essentially, we operate as a kind of agency that sit between the organisations that we support and the communities and people that we support. So yeah, that's us. That's Gaysians. I think one of the key focus areas for us is really just around visibility and letting people know that positive visibility, letting people know that it can be really tough for people in our communities, but there is support available and you're not alone. One of the pieces of research that we found is that the BBC published a report in 2018 that stated that British South Asians are the group that are most likely to disapprove of same-sex relationships. And so we're twice as likely to face opposition at home than the UK national average of any other racial group. And so that is not known because we're so silenced. People don't actually realise how horribly marginalised our communities are. We're twice as likely to face opposition at home, but when we look at AKT and homelessness prevention, for example, some of the recent data that we've got through their studies have shown us that although that they are having really great cut through with people of colour communities broadly, South Asians are only utilising their services at 7%. Now, we're 14% of the UK population. We're twice as likely to be displaced, and we're only utilising services at half the level that we should be, right? Just without getting into the nuances of that data and what I could argue, essentially, that's telling us that there's a problem. And that what we really need is more support, and we need our own surveys. But again, you know, when it comes to the workplace, obviously all of this by extension has a huge impact on how we are navigating relationships, whether they're personal or they're professional. And like I said, I think that censorship can be a real challenge, and we're often assimilating and carrying that through into our workplace environments. And so I think being in a space where we are able to be fully ourselves is crucially important, whether that's in our personal lives or in the work environment. That's what I want to say. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you, Rita. That's a great introduction to occasions. So I'll now move over to Tom and for his introductory remarks. Over to you, Tom.
Hi, thanks very much, Adrian, and great to hear about occasions from Rita. I'm going to try and share some slides, but we'll see how that goes. If not, hopefully some in the background might be able to pull them up for me. So my name is Tom Ketteley, and I am currently an assistant director over in UK Visa and Immigration. But outside of work, I also sit on the Law Society LGBT+ division, and I've got a few other hats, being an independent panel member for the Greater London Authority and an independent person for the City of London Corporation. And all of those kind of extra roles and additional things have come to me through the diversity and inclusion work that I'm kind of involved in. So I was going to start kind of in this kind of 10 minutes to run through a little bit about kind of me and why I'm here, but then to kind of move on to kind of thinking about kind of being out at work and bringing my whole self to work and why that's important. Before then thinking about building platforms for others and kind of how I've gone about doing that. And then thinking also kind of some kind of call to action for people to have a kind of takeaway as things that they might want to do both at an individual level and at an organizational level. If and when kind of we manage to get the slides up, you will see some wonderful pictures of my husband. You had Lisa sharing pictures of her wife earlier, so you get a chance to meet my husband Julio and see us in all our glory. But for me, kind of, it's been so important for me as part of kind of my kind of leadership journey to be comfortable in my own skin and to be really kind of open and honest about who I am, so that I can really deliver for those teams that are working to me. For context, in my kind of operation area in the Home Office, there are about 950 staff kind of within our directorate, and I kind of operate a team of kind of 50. Fantastic, here we go. So if we can go on to the next slide. So here we are, here's my husband in the middle. Here's me crying a lot on my wedding day 7 years ago. And here are our kind of cat and dog. We've got Mary Berry, the cat, and Nigella Lawson is our lockdown puppy. Now, for me, it's absolutely vital that I can kind of talk about my husband. He's a baker by profession, ex-lawyer, now turned social media baker. It would just be kind of completely unnatural for me not to be able to kind of turn up to work with a whole load of cakes or biscuits or things that he's tried and be able to kind of share that and to hide that part of myself. And so as I've kind of progressed into kind of more and more leadership roles, it's been increasingly important for me to be kind of creating that safe space for others, whether that is in that LGBT space or whether that is in kind of with every other kind of protected characteristic. So my first job straight out of university, I went and lived and worked in Kazakhstan for a year. And I was out with my kind of program office. I was out to kind of the expats and to kind of an interpreter that I worked with, but I wasn't out of the closet for the kind of the local kind of staff and kind of the community I was working in. And I hadn't appreciated actually quite how difficult that was going to be. And I remember at that time kind of saying, I'm never doing this again. I've been out at university, gone back into the closet for that role. There's particular context working in Kazakhstan, kind of being queer in Kazakhstan, kind of in the mid-noughties, wasn't really the most accepting place, but there was a gay community there, which I kind of tapped into and got kind of connected into, but it was still very kind of hidden. And that was really kind of quite uncomfortable for me personally. I've been really fortunate then in kind of my subsequent career that I have always been kind of out and proud at work. So right from the kind of the first job that I had as a trainee solicitor and then onwards. And actually kind of and this may reflect some of the privilege that I have, I think it's been a benefit, a bonus to me, rather than a disadvantage or a hindrance. I think it has shown kind of a certain strength of character, particularly in kind of the legal profession, where it's been valued rather than where there are kind of concerns over it. And I think certainly as I've moved into doing more leadership things, it's kind of another string to my bow. So I am very visible and vocal. You've got the kind of the pride flag behind me. I wish it was the progressive pride flag, which is currently in my locker at work. So you've got my kind of replacement one here. And it's through things like being on that independent panel member. I think it's really important that we are going to and kind of putting our money where our mouth is and really kind of taking action. So I sit as an independent panel member, and I managed to throw in at every introduction and in every bio about me that I'm involved in the Law Society LGBT division, just to give that signal, that kind of clue that diversity is being championed. And even if it's not kind of your diversity, it's still there and being kind of recognized. So I've got kind of a little patter that I managed to throw into kind of these conversations. It's always a case of kind of coming out. Kind of coronavirus, we had a couple of kind of comments about kind of coronavirus and kind of different arrangements while we've been listening this morning. And for me, kind of, there are some kind of reflections on coronavirus and where I think that I've really added value into the leadership team that I'm in, particularly kind of recognizing that for the experience of lockdown for LGBT colleagues may be very different from others. So you've got kind of less ability to access kind of those LGBT safe spaces that people might use as part of their kind of community and kind of the mental health impacts upon that. Also kind of real issues there, kind of quite a lot of our kind of workforce in our directorate are younger. So kind of ideas of people going back home where they may not be out in the same way that they are when they're kind of living away or kind of in the workplace and kind of those mixed identities that people have. And David was talking earlier about kind of HIV status. I think that's really interesting because we've had great numbers of people kind of shielding. So I've been shielding myself through some kind of medication that I take. Most people at work wouldn't know that kind of I have a medical condition. But for the last year, I've been kind of locked down and not going out. And I think kind of particularly when you kind of start to overlay that kind of HIV status and some people who've been required to shield, you've got people who are needing to disclose very personal information and kind of coronavirus has put that into real sharp focus. And as organizations, we need to be kind of really mindful how we navigate some of those kind of overlapping competing identities that people have. I find that I do often get approached for advice, but it's not just about LGBT things. I think it's from being that kind of open and visible and vocal difference from kind of others who might be around at my level. What I find is that I get approached for kind of things around bullying, harassment, discrimination, where people kind of see me as that kind of friendly face that they can go and talk to about things and kind of do coaching. And I think that's one of the real values where kind of role models come in any of the protected characteristics that people have. It's really being able to kind of create those environments where people feel that they can bring their whole selves to work. And kind of very recently, I was doing some coaching with someone for some interview preparation, and she's a black woman looking for a new role, and had been told by others to kind of not really talk about that, and kind of to kind of diminish that side of her. My kind of pushback when I hear that from people is kind of, you need to do what's authentic and comfortable for yourself. But in my own kind of circumstance, I don't want to work for homophobes, and I don't want to work with homophobes. So I want them to know right early on about me being LGBT, about me being gay, because I want them to sift me out straight away. I don't want to waste my time kind of in those kind of processes. And the same for kind of for her. One of the reasons why she was particularly attracted to this role was around the diversity in that kind of particular legal space. And she gave me kind of an okayish answer as to why she wanted the role. And then we unpacked that. And she was like, well, actually, I'm really keen because of what they've said around kind of supporting particularly Black female progression. Well, you need to tell them that, because that's what they're after. They're making the right signals to you, and you need to be giving that back to them. And I'm really pleased that she got the role. But kind of it's a disappointing conversation to have, that other people have been coaching her in kind of different ways. So I guess how I kind of build and create platforms for others is about making space. So just thinking about kind of this panel event, when we were discussing kind of coming on to it, one of the things that I was asking, well, who are the other panelists? And are we making sure that the event has that kind of diversity of kind of lived experience kind of threaded throughout it? And if not, I'm really happy to help you find other people to kind of fill my space. And I like to feel myself as a bit of a connector in that way, recognizing kind of the privilege that I have within that kind of LGBT space. And I really encourage kind of all of us to kind of think, well, how can you kind of give that leg up and help others and kind of create that space at the table. So things like, I was asked last year to write something for Pride in the Law Gazette. And rather than doing an article myself, I kind of brought in other voices. So an ally, a kind of a bi colleague, as well as someone who was British Asian. And for me, that was a way of kind of putting my money where my mouth is. There you are. So you can see kind of Carly, Issa and Dan. I managed to kind of twist their arm to write something alongside me and give that kind of variety of voices, rather than using our kind of one opportunity to get into the main legal publication for solicitors and just have my voice. So I'm really conscious that we've got kind of not much time, so I will kind of wrap up with maybe a call for action, and then some other things I'll try and pick up when we are kind of discussing it as a panel. But I would kind of encourage kind of people to really kind of have some of that personal accountability and to kind of hold things that are dear to you and kind of make them a feature of your kind of leadership style. So for me, I won't sit on all male interview panels. I now won't sit on all white interview panels. And that's just kind of one of my kind of red lines. And people know that about me, and they know that kind of they won't be able to do that, but I will find someone else to help them fit into that space if they need that kind of diversity. I think at the junior end, if kind of you are supporting kind of, if you are or you're supporting kind of people at the junior end of their career, then look to see how you can help them reverse mentor the people, the dinosaurs at the top of organizations. And I think if you are moving towards the top or at the top of an organization, think about how you can reach down and do kind of just genuine mentoring with kind of protected characteristic groups. And really kind of have that as a feature of your leadership. And as I said, if you've got a platform, give it to others where you can. And at an organizational level, this is kind of a really call for action for all of those who are kind of in those kind of power structures. A lot of this diversity work people do as a side hustle along the edge of everything else they're doing, and it takes time and it takes energy. And to really value and to build into your kind of performance structures and to just your kind of your DNA of your organization, how you can give equal weight, if not more weight, to kind of some of these side activities that are going on and create that space and support and be that ally that we've been hearing about. So I'll wrap up there because I'm conscious that I'll be running over my 10 minutes shortly and lots more ideas hopefully for the discussions later on.
Thank you very much, Tom. Really interesting thoughts you have there. And just as a reminder for those who are watching, we have a lovely question and answer box answer box. I see our first one is in there, but do keep putting those in so we have a good panel debate after our next two speakers. So I'm now going to hand over to Jacqui for her slot of 10 minutes. Over to you, Jacqui.
Thank you, Adrian. And of course, thank you, Tom. I know your story, and I can just say it's just such a truly inspirational one to yourself and also to the many people that you've been involved in. But before I begin, I just want to pause for a moment to remember two of my very good friends, Lisa Lawrence and Nadine Shepherd, who fell in the last week or so. Two members of our trans community who at the tender ages of just 39 and 58 have left us and that wider world behind. And I want to, of course, dedicate my message to them. As Adrian has said, my name is Jacqui Gavin. I am the Culture, Inclusion and Belonging Manager with British Vote, a startup leading the charge, if you pardon the pun, in putting vehicle electrification at the heart of all our futures. Prior to that, I was leading equality, diversity, inclusion, and also positive action with Cambridgeshire Fire and Rescue Service. But as proud as I am to have served at the fire service, perhaps my proudest moment to date was the role that I played in playing my small part, ensuring that the wider UK civil service became the most inclusive employer in the UK. My role allowed me to ensure that through my engagement on the conversation around transgender across Whitehall, when I was incredibly fortunate to be the chair of the Cross Civil Service Network, Agender, meant we were more likely to talk about this conversation with the volume turned up. All too often, when we talk about trans issues, the volume is spoken about in a whisper. This role, along with me being a well-respected trans rights activist since the early 80s, allowed me to raise the profile of what it means to be trans and working in the civil service, and how we equally can shape the agenda beyond that of the front door of the civil service. From that, I was able to then take that wider aspect by moving into more deeper roles, into having that wider conversation within the Department for Work and Pension, the Department for International Trade, and before I moved into the Fire and Rescue Service within the Cabinet office. I feel fortunate to have been leading that role and being a leading role model in this arena. I feel fortunate to have been attained the recognition for that work in my personal life and through the national and international awards and honours I've received. But it's not the reason why I do what I do. I do it because it's the right thing to do. However, I'm not here just to talk about me, and I wouldn't be doing the just deserved messages for Lisa and Nadine, so please forgive me for stepping on that soapbox. Global societies across many parts of our world are making legal and cultural progress to embrace LGBT community, but many companies are still lagging behind in this process. LGBT employees still find it difficult, as we've already heard, to bring their full identities to work. While allies do empower people, they still struggle to give that full volume, as I would call it. It's hard to believe that almost 3 billion people live in countries where consensual same-sex activity is criminalized. Although we've had significant progress, and it has been made quite a bit in the last few years, it is also imperative to note that work still needs to be done in this area. According to the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association, being gay is still punishable in 70 UN member states by imprisonment, torture, or even death. And not one grants the same rights to LGBT people as that of their wider heterosexual counterparts. In countries where laws are relatively accepting, the LGBT communities such as Europe, the Americas, oceanic states, LGBT people are still likely to suffer backlash in the streets and obviously in certain cultures, and it can be very, very slow to change. Take the example of same-sex marriage. In a survey on European views of minorities, the majority of people are in favour of gay and lesbian marriage in Western Europe. Almost all of those countries are now legalized this practice. However, we know that in some and Central Eastern European countries, none of those that allow same-sex marriage, most of those citizens of these countries are against it because they don't understand it. It's been estimated that nearly 2/3 of the recent historical changes in attitudes towards same-sex marriage in these countries is due to people who are personally affected by it in one way or another. But for such a personal connection to happen, LGBT people still need to come out. Whilst revealing one's sexual orientation may be seen as a choice, for most LGBT members anyway, transgender people like me don't often have that liberty. Our transition is visible. Although between 0.05% and 1.7% of the world population is born with intersex traits, that's basically like saying that intersex is about as common as having red hair. But still, transgender people are often stigmatized and subject to multiple human rights violations. Is it any wonder that it was only in June 2018 that the World Health Organization proposed to remove gender incongruence from the list of mental illnesses? And we know that for non-binary gender, it's not understood, and as such, is not legally recognized in most countries. And as such, the wider umbrella of trans means that transgender people are not always granted the same legal rights across the world consistently. We know that in the US, the National Transgender Discrimination Survey revealed that 40% of trans people have attempted suicide in their lifetime. That's nearly 9 times the average rate for the US population. A majority, i.e. 60% of trans people, reported that their family was supportive of their transgender identity. Yet over 50% of those have been harassed at school, work, and or have suffered physical or sexual violence. And nearly 30% of them have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. We also know that trans people are 3 times more likely to live in poverty and to be unemployed. But also according to the same survey on global attitudes towards trans people, this survey went across a further 16 countries, and still 30% of people surveyed worried about exposing children to trans people, and only 40% would use the correct pronouns when addressing those individuals. Realizing one's sexual orientation or gender identity, and then sharing this information will be a gradual process. We accept that. But despite the legal gains, most lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people still choose not to disclose their sexual orientation or their gender identity. We know that the Human Rights Campaign Foundation also found out that 46% of LGBT individuals are closeted at work still, and 28% are totally closeted and not open to anyone in their lives. I also know that coming out takes courage. It's an ongoing process that LGBT people have to face every time they meet someone new. There are several reasons for this. Why LGBT do still stay in that closet. Fear of discrimination. 25 to 75% of LGBT employees encounter discrimination in the workplace. Lack of trust, damaging promotional opportunities, difficulty in proving discrimination, or fear of job loss, especially right now in the middle of a pandemic. Negative reaction from family, friends, colleagues, and society in general. And of course, the religious and the legal implications. However, remaining in the closet has consequences. Whether on the factory floor or at board level, evading questions about family life can be a challenge. The boundaries between personal and professional life can be blurred since the workplace is full of seemingly innocuous chit-chat, such as, how was your weekend? How was your holiday? How was your life? How was your husband, spouse, children, so on and so forth? Every time these questions are asked, closeted LGBT people need to make a choice. Should I ignore it? Should I lie about it? Should I avoid the personal discussion completely? It's how we find that closeted employees tend to become more and more isolated. 39% avoid or become less engaged with their colleagues. In addition, since not sharing one's personal life, often seen as a lack of authenticity and honesty by peers or supervisors or even whatever, closeted LGBT individuals can suffer on so many levels. I've talked about the hostility in the workplace can be even stronger for minorities within minorities who often suffer what I would call the double discrimination, i.e. LGBT individuals of color or as well as lesbian and trans colleagues. But whilst it's important to recognize, this is equally important that we as members of the LGBT community reach out to our cis brothers and sisters who might not understand the noise and normalize the conversation. What I want to do is normalize it. It will take us forward together. It's what my fallen friends Lise and Nadine would have wanted. So in memory of them, I want to hold out my hands and say to you all, when we open to questions, think of the question that you feel will normalize the conversation. Normalize it for you and normalize it for me. In return, I promise you that instead of making being LGBT a thing, we will make it a point that allows you and I to coexist and it becomes the norm for all of us. I'm going to stop there and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacqui, for those very, very good thoughts and in our memory of these two great transgender activists that we've lost over the past couple of weeks. And then we move on to our final panelist, Ian. Over to you for your 10 minutes of thoughts.
Adrian, thank you. Really great to be here. And once again, thank you to Dods for inviting me to contribute to today's panel conference. I'm just hoping you can see some slides appearing in front of you. I'll wait for a positive return. Can you see those okay, Adrian? Are they coming up? Yeah, thank you. All right, I'm just going to put them into slide view. There we go. Brilliant. Well, look, once again, lovely to be here. And conscious of time, not least for our online audience, I think, you know, really looking forward to getting into the heat of the debate today with people. I've already seen one or two really interesting comments and questions come through. So just a few words of introduction from me. I'll try and be relatively succinct. But first and foremost, the day job. So I am a director in a national NHS organisation called NHS Resolution. We provide indemnity cover, where effectively the NHS's in-house insurer. And I've been here for the last sort of 5 or 6 years. Alongside that, I'm also an advisor to a relatively new national LGBT network within the NHS. And it's interesting the fact that, you know, up until 18 months ago, the NHS did not have that platform to support LGBTQ plus staff at a national level, seeking to influence policy, particularly employment policy. And I think it's interesting. We will come back to that a bit later. I just wanted to share with you some, you know, personal thoughts about my journey, and it's quite a long journey. Forgive me, and that is not me in the photograph, I don't think. But yeah, this very much is an image that I recollect of me lining up on London's embankment next to the Thames in April 1988 in an anti-Clause 28 march that I took part in just after I graduated. And it's interesting and somewhat sad today. Here we are on the 15th of June 2021, where politicians in Hungary are debating today in their national parliament a very, very similar piece of legislation. I think a lot of people of my generation will have been impacted by the HIV/AIDS epidemic that clearly did rage in the late 80s, early 90s, and I think just the fact that a lot of the messaging that we saw recently in Russell T Davis's "It's a Sin" was very quite nostalgic and very, very sad about the impact of that particular pandemic at the time, particularly among gay and bisexual men back in the 1980s, 90s. Riding forward to a few years ago now, this is me in my kind of alter ego outfit, and Adrian knows me through this route as well. We actually met during my year as the elected Lord Mayor of Westminster, next to Sadiq Khan, and he and I had the honour of jointly leading that year's Pride in London parade. So this is very much, me as I think I was the first openly gay Lord Mayor of Westminster, and it was a real honour to use that platform. And it was a platform I gave a lot of thought to during the year, and in fact since then, in terms of the privilege that I've had in terms of using the access that I've had through PR, publicity, what have you, to promote inclusive messages to the wider community. This is Christopher, my partner, on our wedding day, in a piece that we placed in the Evening Standard to coincide with that year's Pride. Coming more up to date, I am still a local politician alongside my NHS role. So I'm the LGBT lead member for Westminster, and for those of you who may not know, Westminster is home to Soho, one of the oldest LGBT communities in the country, if not beyond. And I do spend a lot of my time promoting the work that Westminster does, working with local license holders, like local licensed premises, for example. I launched a scheme 3 years ago called Soho Angels, which provides kind of on-street support to late night revelers, gay and straight, he said, who might need some help and assistance if they get into a little bit of difficulty, should we say, worse for wear, particularly concerning alcohol on the streets of Soho. And over on the right, I had the privilege of being invited by the UK's ambassador to Italy to take part in Rome Pride back in 2018 as well. So there's me sort of waving the UK flag outside the Colosseum. Just alighting briefly on Adrian's question at the start about that culture in terms of how one might look at promoting, affecting, supporting culture within organisations and arguably between organisations in terms of inclusion and diversity. And I think it's really incumbent upon leaders such as myself to help to, if you like, provide the right atmosphere, the right temperature, often through communicating a clear, confident vision about what EDI means within a particular organisational setting. I'm very pleased that NHS Resolution adopted a new EDI strategy this time last year, and that provides a platform for me to do what I do, both inside the organisation and externally, supporting a lot of this work. I think, from an employment point of view, it goes without saying that a lot of employers nowadays have pretty robust, well-proven, well-trod policies concerning inclusion, but perhaps it's less the case for smaller employers. However, it may be there are ways that large employers like NHS bodies can support smaller organisations in their communities to adopt similar working practices. Just a little bit further on, in terms of, it's come up a few times today, the really important role of straight allies, supportive networks, and that kind of sort of support we have from those other networks around us. I'm very pleased to say that recently we've also launched a BAME staff network in my organisation, which provides a kind of mirror, if you like, for the work that we're doing around disability, around LGBT, and around other staff inclusion topics. I think visibility through my experience is really important. I think we've got some great people on today's platform. I think we're all as visible as one another, albeit in different ways, sharing one's success and doing so, as I think Tom illustrated really ably earlier, sharing that in a collegiate way with others as well. I think that's really, really important, not to hog the limelight. And to be supporting what's going on inside your organisations. We all have access nowadays to multiple social channels. So working with your media teams, particularly, getting the organisation to line up its resources formally, I think is extremely important. It may come up as a topic today for conversation around the role of reverse mentoring. I'm a great believer in reverse mentoring, not only from an LGBT perspective, but in other regards as well. I think data are really important, particularly for organisations like mine that sort of from a cultural point of view are very evidence-based. You don't necessarily have to do things in a way that people may be reluctant to come forward. I think you need to be prepared for perhaps adopting a degree of anonymity, respecting people's privacy, and the sensitivity that goes with identifying as LGBTQ. But there's definitely a role for whether it's feedback channels and respecting confidentiality, particularly in terms of referring on particular matters that may need to be supported by additional counselling, mentoring, HROD support. I think line managers, particularly middle managers, team leaders, are really key. This guidance is a little bit dated now from 2014, but I think a lot of its content still applies. And I think managers do need direct support. They can really help to set the tone within the organisation to establish and reinforce the positivity of that culture. But conversely, I think if managers feel unsupported or underconfident, even to the extent of using the appropriate language, coming back to Jacqui's example earlier of inappropriate or at least clumsy language and questioning after one returns from the weekend. I think managers need to be very cognizant about the risk of those kind of microaggressions. And conversely, I think it's important to reflect your internal successes externally. So using your staff networks as a badge, a promotional badge, whether it's for recruitment, whether it's for branding, or whether it's really just to kind of bridge the gap, if you will, between an employee working within an organizational setting and being part of a wider network, a wider community, possibly a family context as well for some. So I think it's important to reflect that two-way aspect. So really, Adrian, that's really what I wanted to kind of alight on. Forgive the rather garish outfit. I shan't reveal what I was or perhaps wasn't wearing underneath the outfit on that very hot July day 4 years ago, but very much looking forward now to getting into the conversation with panel colleagues. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ian, for a lovely presentation. And yes, it's remarkable how we remember when we met the first time was at that particular event. So it's great that we can continue along the relationship as they go, sort of thing. I'm going to we've got a good 20 minutes or so I want to try and get into some of the issues that have come up in the chat or in the question and answer area. And I think one of them I'm going to take firstly is around employee resourcing groups and how they work within the government sphere. We have a number of people who've worked in government through Cabinet Office and other places as well. And Tom are currently in that sort of role. How do employee resourcing groups work and how beneficial can they be to having that conversation in that space? So if I go to Tom perhaps first and then on to Jacqui and Ian subsequently.
So I think it's really important to have that diversity of opinion kind of bubbling up towards the top of organisations where decisions are being made. Too often when you kind of look around the room, there isn't yet that the kind of the results of the kind of diversity gains that are being made in other places. So kind of employee engagement at all levels, which can then inform and kind of help make decisions, help make people understand kind of where the sticking points are. I think we're seeing a lot of that at the moment in terms of kind of coronavirus and kind of return to work and actually just how difficult it is to make the right choices and decisions where you haven't got that diversity of lived experience. So kind of, yeah, I certainly see it kind of being really helpful. One thing that we're doing kind of in our area, we've all got kind of lead priorities for kind of key activities, and it's really noticeable that actually there's not much diversity among those people who do those lead priorities. So this year we've reached out to staff and invited people to kind of nominate themselves to come along and support the kind of the senior leadership team with delivering some of those priorities as a way of getting us different diversity and different voices in the room.
Super, thanks. Over to Jacqui.
So I think ERGs provide a great platform. I mean, I mentioned about being the chair of the Cross Civil Service Network, Agenda. I mean, I think all too often, sometimes we find that there can be challenges along the road in getting voices heard, because a majority of ERGs usually, I'm not saying always, but usually are made up of more of the junior grades, and trying to get that voice up to the next level can be a bit of a challenge. Whereas I know, and I believe that we'll really be able to get this kind of thing, and Tom, you will have seen it yourself in the civil service, is that we are able to get that voice really heard at the real critical points, right up to the PermSec level, even up to the Cabinet Secretary. Jeremy Haywood, who was the then Cabinet Secretary when I was at the civil service, really made this a top priority, and getting those voices heard that allows us to be able to really break through what I call the permafrost, and really getting the conversation going right throughout the organization is so important. So I think the more and more we encourage those ERGs to be a voice, and I keep on going back to this point about turning that volume up, so that eventually every single person in the organization feels connected with it in some way, shape or form. Because particularly from an LGBT perspective, and speaking about it from a trans perspective more specifically, I didn't just go through this process myself. I had colleagues who went through this process with me. So the more we can encourage that, the more we can encourage conversation, the more becomes some sort of normality in that space as well.
Thank you, Jacqui. Ian.
Yeah, just concurring with a lot of that, Adrian. I think it's, in my mind, I think success rests very much on a mutual partnership, if you would. And I think it's really incumbent upon those groups to view their role through the strategic lens of the organization or the employer or the marketplace. You know, I think otherwise, I think the big risk is that we will continue to be regarded as peripheral, underpowered, and afterthought. So, you know, you've got to have real skin in the game here. So it's great to hear Jacqui talking about her kind of cabinet office experience under Jeremy Haywood. So, you know, I think we really need to almost turn it around and challenge ourselves as representatives of our own communities within the workplace, and to see where we can bring some real value add to the debate, whether that's around employment policies, changing employment policies, whether that's around ensuring from a marketing and comms point of view, which is my professional domain, that the organization is properly and truly and authentically representing the stakeholders that it's there to serve.
Thank you. A question now more directed towards Reeta, which is from Josh, who's asking around, you know, perhaps there's a lack of enthusiasm from the sort of South Asian community to get involved with LGBTQ forums, or, you know, how can we try and improve and get more people from that community involved, and what ways do you suggest are perhaps good pathways for perhaps those of us who are allies to the community as well can learn and understand?
Hi there, Josh. Thanks for the question. It's a great question, and I think that I think we sort of we have to remember that the challenge that South Asian communities have about the LGBT+ community come from British colonial legislation, and for several generations now there has been a sort of development of thought, essentially, that and along with that criminal legislation, that has transcended into diasporic communities around the world. So that, my parents' and grandparents' generation, for example, they left India in a state where, a time when it was extremely taboo and criminal to be a member of our community. And so, they have carried those thoughts over here. And I often think of these sort of generations, previous generations of South Asians, as having, as with all diasporic communities, as with Brits, when Brits move abroad as well, people tend to hold on to a sort of snapshot of, it's like being in a time capsule. Their concept of the motherland is actually static and stuck in a place, often from childhood, that doesn't actually even exist anymore. So when I spend time in India with activists there, and I go to Bombay Pride and we fought for legislation change, etc., it's a very, very different space that we're in now to the one that my parents and grandparents left, right? But the problem is that there's a gap that people haven't had, where they haven't had that education, and that's been compounded by the fact that we are not visible in the media or on the street or in public spaces, workspaces, etc., etc., etc. So it's a self-fulfilling kind of a problem that we have. To break through that requires some people to take a risk, right? For some people that risk is greater, and for some it's smaller. I think so that's just a bit of background as to why we are in this advanced state that we're in terms of essentially a lot of resistance to homosexuality and gender identities from South Asian people in diasporic spaces like the UK. We tend to be much more accepting of trans people, just because culturally trans is just, you can have a third gender identity on your, or sex on your passport more correctly. You can, the hijra community is huge, although it's suppressed. There are about 3,000 different words just for gender identity in South Asia, in India actually alone. So what we find is that gender is much more acceptable. I don't know if that might help in some way in terms of the individuals that you choose to pick out, but my solution for you would be I don't know the size of your organization or how many people you're referring to, but when people see somebody like themselves, and that, for me, that was very specifically, I needed to see somebody that was assigned female at birth, that identified as a lesbian, in order for me to feel included, right? I didn't necessarily feel included by seeing gay Asian men in spaces, right? So, because misogyny is real in South Asian culture, as it is in the LGBT+ community, is massive, right? So I think it's about really looking at what is the makeup of the community that you are trying to reach, and then trying to really speak to them in terms of having people like them potentially be visible as a spokesperson or a role model, right? Now, I did this anonymously myself. Most of the people that we work with will not be out to some form of their environment. And so it's very rare for there to be someone like me that can be fully out and say whatever I want in terms of representing our community. In the most part, that's not the case. So if there is somebody or a couple of people that you can find that maybe represent more broadly the people that you're trying to speak to, whether that's in terms of religion or age or gender identity, whatever it might be, if you can try and sort of work with them to be a bit more visible and have a campaign around that, with some information about that, that would really help. The other side of it is that they may need to be anonymous, and there may be some anon work that you can do. You can also reach out and try to ask people if they want to be involved in a small group, perhaps, that is a collective, that could be a kind of private group, that is a community. So a lot of our most impactful work happens in small community group settings that are essentially safe spaces and are confidential spaces. If you're able to create that kind of safety for the LGBTQ+ members who are South Asian of your organisation, I would say that would be a really beautiful thing to do as well. Without knowing any more, I think that's probably all I can say. But if you head to gageons.org, you can get in touch with us, and I'm sure the team would love to help out in any way as well. But thanks for the question, Josh.
Adrian, may I come in with some experience to share from what we've done at the Law Society and the LGBT division? So one of our ways of kind of reaching people, not necessarily just kind of South Asian, but kind of people who are not out at work, has been to kind of blend events with kind of different protected characteristics and different reasons why people can legitimately go along to that without necessarily going along to the LGBT thing, that they're going there for something else. And so kind of in for example, we've done speed networking. We kind of also have put quite a lot of content online so that people can access it on their own as kind of that first step, and then kind of bringing them on to kind of going to more face-to-face things. And something that I do kind of at work is kind of bring in lawyers to talk about kind of their profession and kind of their journey in the law, because that's kind of the area that I work in. But I'm really careful about who I select to bring in. So I will have kind of people who don't fit that mold for being a lawyer. And I think kind of within all the things that we've put on for staff, actually there are lots of opportunities there if we kind of join up and kind of think a bit more creatively about the voices that we're hearing.
Thank you. You did my job for me there, Tom, because you preempted my next question. So well done. That was extremely good linkage, but without knowing. Moving on to another question, and I want to ask this question, but I want to ask it from an ally perspective first. And that is around helping someone who comes to, so Sarah's asked a question around transitioning and someone coming to you and wanted to talk about it, but I want to get the ally perspective first, and then we'll come to Jacqui at the end and see what she has to say. But I go with you first, Ian. What would be your ways of understanding and listening to someone in that sense?
Thanks, Adrian. And for me, this is a real question. So I have actually been in this situation, and I was, it was for me, it was personally, it was quite a moving, emotionally moving situation to be asked to have a very early conversation in a colleague, friend's transitioning journey at a time when they had not spoken to any other professionals in their network, and the individual, I think it was a real moment in their life. It was the first time that they wished to meet me in their new, if I can call it this, forgive me if I get the words wrong, but in their new emerging persona, and that was a very, very important part of their transitioning journey. And they were transitioning from male to female, and I was actually really nervous, very nervous. We met in a public space in a hotel in London's West End at their request. I think that was also part of the process, and yeah, it was. I think the fundamental point from all of that is just be there, just make yourself available. And it's really hard at the moment because of this ongoing situation with the pandemic and stuff. But if you can just make yourself available as practically as possible to colleagues, to friends, and I think we all have contacts and we all can help with signposting. But often it's just, it sounds awfully trite, but it really is just being an ear, lending a pair of ears to people.
Thank you, Ian. Reeta, what would be your thoughts?
Yeah, I think being available and being present, and it is really hard at the moment. So many of our communities are, particularly as intersectional people who are, juggling so much at the moment, it's a tough time on top of everything else, and unfortunately we're seeing that the people that are the most vulnerable and most marginalised are being most affected. So it can feel really hard and challenging at times to find that energy and that space to be there for them. But I think if we can do that, it can have such a radically huge difference, an impact on somebody's life. And I think there are also lots and lots of resources and support tools that are available out there as well. So, it is worth sort of reaching out to organisations and support networks that are there that can assist you and assist them as well. I was speaking recently to a friend in India who has been contacted by somebody she knows through a friend who has gone through some significant trauma out there, and she contacted me because she wanted to know where to go. And I think reaching out to your networks and looking at how, I think the pandemic is making us become very, very grassroots and very focused on what we already have. I keep coming back to this thing of like, what do I already have? What can I do with what I have? What can I contribute with what I have? And when we're out the sort of race of productivity, we can sort of take a moment to just be very present and look at the resources internally and externally that we already have. And actually, most of us are very abundant, and we have a lot more than we've realised. Particularly if we have the privilege of participating in a conversation like this. So there is often, we have more available to us than we realise, is my point. So even if we don't have it on a very personal level and we may be struggling with that, there are other spaces that we can go for support. So it's just worth thinking about that.
Thank you, Rita. And Tom, a thought from you?
So just kind of maybe more general thoughts around kind of supporting kind of trans kind of colleagues and friends. Something that I've really noticed in the last kind of year and a half with the work I do at the Law Society is just how difficult an environment it is, and it seems to be getting worse. And we have a trans inclusion group, and kind of we've supported our kind of trans kind of committee members by kind of giving them kind of that permission to take a step back from being in that trans inclusion group and allowing us to kind of take things forward and do things kind of as allies for kind of trans colleagues, because actually it's just relentless. And I don't think I really had appreciated quite how difficult things were until I started to get a bit more involved, and it's really tough. So it'd be interesting to kind of hear what Jacqui has to say.
Thank you, Tom. And over to as probably our last answer on this one. Over to you, Jacqui.
I think it's all of the above, what everybody's just said, but most important of all for anybody that is trans and going through this process is to be led by the individual. This is such a unique thing, and it's a unique experience. For some, they want it to be out there, visible, etc., etc. For some, they just want to be left alone in the background to be able to go through the process. So my word of real counsel is be led by the individual, because the individual knows what they want. There is no denying that many people just want that acceptance for who they are, for going through what they're going through. And for that acceptance, as I say, it may be all the bells and whistles, etc., etc. For the other individual, it may be just something that's quietly done in the background. Just don't forget to ask the individual, what can you do? What can you do to support? Anything that can be done. It's just be led by the individual.
Thank you very much, Jacqui. And I think that's a very important point to finish our panel debate on, in terms of inclusivity and listening to what an individual wants to do and respecting their wishes, rather than assuming and prejudging what they may or may not wish you to want to say or ask. And I think that's a lesson for all of us in terms of making our space and our workplace environment space the most inclusive it possibly can be. And on that note, I will thank our 4 excellent panelists, Rita, Tom, Jacqui and Ian. And thank you for all your contributions this afternoon. And then we will head off for another 10 minutes comfort break before we come back for our next session. Thank you all.
Thank you, Adrian. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.